This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 4, Printing. In this lesson, we'll talk about writing media. So as I mentioned in the introduction, it's when we're studying printing, we shouldn't just pay attention to the technology of the printer itself. We should also pay attention to the technology of what is being printed on. And this is what I'll call the writing media, the material which a text is written or printed on. So it's important to note that the advancement in writing and the advancement in printing also evolved along with advancements in the writing media. So the materials used to write on over time have become lighter and cheaper to produce. So it's important to look at these physical and financial costs of these kinds of materials. And more specifically, one important fact that demonstrates the importance of the writing medium was how the invention of paper was actually very important for Gutenberg's printing press to be successful. And the reason for this is that paper as material is much more available in Europe and much cheaper compared to vellum, which is made of animal skins. So we'll talk about that in this lesson. So as we noticed in a lot of the ancient methods of printing, we saw that a lot of the writing media were printed into clay. And we see that clay was used fairly frequently as an early writing medium. And there are a lot of advantages to using clay, one of which is that it is a relatively lightweight material, at least compared to stone. So carving something into stone would make a writing material that is very heavy, but clay would be much lighter. Clay was also something that is very easily available, especially in riverbeds where many of these early societies existed. And clay is something that is very moldable, so it's very easy to change its shape, get different amounts of it, write things into it, and so on. But once you fire it, once you heat it up, it becomes more durable, and it can last thousands of years until we're able to read them today. So clay is very useful in that sense. Nonetheless, the clay is still a fairly heavy material to actually use. You are still, compared to things like paper, for example, clay is still fairly heavy. And because of this, we see that the size of your document that you would want to make if you lived in an ancient civilization is very limited. And because of this, we can see that in a lot of ancient artifacts, the writing actually used in these artifacts is very, very small. This is very likely because they were just trying to cram a lot of writing into the small space. So we can see just how small this is by looking at a cuneiform tablet, which can fit in the palm of someone's hand, as we can see in that picture. So from these facts, we can see the impact that the writing material has on the way that writing is actually performed. So a later invention which occurred in Egypt was the invention of something called papyrus. So if we want to make a document that's much longer, using clay or stone would be something that's just too difficult. So a lighter material is needed to make a longer document. And this was done using a kind of plant called papyrus. Papyrus is a type of reed, a long-stalked plant, which grows in wetlands, and it is native to Egypt. So this plant can be converted into a kind of writing material by cutting it into strips and then pressing them into sheets. And then that can make a very paper-like material which can be used for writing. And once you press these strips into sheets, you can just keep pressing on more and more reeds as you have them. And theoretically, you can make a sheet as long as you want, and you end up getting a very long document. And to store this, you can take that document and roll it up into a scroll. So we can see that papyrus allows you to make a longer document, which was demanded by a more advanced civilization, which needs more writing like this. So papyrus is very good in this way. It's relatively durable, and it's fairly easy to come by in Egypt, and it's very lightweight. So it's a very good writing material for these reasons. The problem is it is very limited in ability. So And in ancient times, papyrus was only available in Egypt and the immediately surrounding areas. If you're from other parts of the world, papyrus wasn't something that was actually really available. So yeah, that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that the availability of a resource like this, depending on a particular climate, will affect how a society can actually use a particular writing medium. So as an aside, I'll talk about an invention which occurred along with this, which is the development of something called a codex. The plural of codex is codices. So codices were developed as a kind of advancement over a scroll. Although scrolls can make you allow you to write a very long document fairly easily, they are still fairly unwieldy. It's kind of hard to go to different parts of the document that you want to go to. To improve this kind of invention, what was developed in multiple societies independently, actually, was developed in multiple different ways. You could take a scroll like this and cut it into sheets, and then bind these sheets on one side. If that process sounds familiar, this is basically the way that our books look like. But this was a novel invention for these people at the time, of course. And so by doing this, it makes it much easier to move throughout the book, and it makes it easier to use in that way. Now, usually these codices were made out of a material called parchment or vellum, which it's a writing material made of animal skin. So since papyrus wasn't as available, animal skins were much more common. So that's a reason why they were made of that kind of material. Codices were independently invented in at least two places, one of which was in Rome, where we get the name codex, but it was also invented in Central America as well. So we can see that there are some Mayan codices, which involve taking a long sheet and then folding it up into an accordion pattern to make a kind of codex. So this is a little bit different from the way that we usually understand how books work, but nonetheless, it is a very similar kind of invention. So it's interesting to see that this happened in both places at the same time. So another writing material that I had alluded to is vellum. So as I said, vellum is a kind of animal skin which is used for writing. And it's advantageous because it's much more available than papyrus, which was at the time was much more exclusive to the specific climate of Egypt, whereas livestock was something that was much more common wherever, all over Europe and in many other places. And now vellum is a material that is fairly durable. In fact, it's actually more durable than paper. Another interesting thing about vellum is that it works much better using inks based on water. Multiple types of inks can be used on vellum. So vellum is fairly useful in that way. It's also, however, despite being more durable, it is more expensive than paper. More specifically, it's roughly, at least in the Middle Ages, it was roughly 6 times as expensive as paper. So it's important to keep in mind that this durability came at a cost. And to give it an idea of how costly this was, if you had to make a large book like the Bible in the Middle Ages, that would require skins from 170 calves. So it was a very, very expensive material to actually use. To a certain extent, it was somewhat prohibitive, actually. So speaking of the Bible, I should talk about how Bibles were actually written and reproduced prior to the invention of printing. So in the Middle Ages, texts were reproduced by scribes, and scribes were mainly monks. So a lot of educational materials and religious materials were reproduced by monks in this period of European history. And what they were most well known for is copying the Bible. And doing this process of actually reproducing the religious text was not only considered a way of producing the text itself, but it was also a kind of religious activity to reflect on the meaning of the text as well. And these texts, as you can kind of tell, were made entirely by hand, and it was a very time-consuming process. And for this reason, we get the word manuscript from the Latin root meaning to write by hand. That's what these early documents were coming from. And to show how expensive it was to make a kind of document like this, it was expected to take about a year to actually produce a copy of the Bible. So it was a fairly expensive process. But also this time-consuming process allowed people to make documents much more elaborate. We see that documents from this period usually had all kinds of ornate patterns around and even within the text. So this was an interesting thing to be aware of as well. Now, because of how difficult it was to actually replace a text, writing and literature were things that were very strongly controlled by the church. It wasn't easy to create a document criticizing a government or criticizing a church and spread it widely, in large part due to the fact that it was just very costly to reproduce a document like this. But we'll see that once the printing press had developed, reducing the cost of printing, this changed this dynamic fundamentally, and it loosened the control of the church on knowledge and education, at least in Europe. So going back to talking about the importance of writing media, we talked about the fact that vellum is a fairly expensive material, much more so than paper. Now, because of this, the scribes had to be very economical with how they used their vellum. As we saw that Mesopotamian civilizations had to write very small to make sure that they were being economical with the amount of clay that they were using. So yeah, since vellum is expensive, one way you could reduce the amount that you use in vellum is to actually recycle the vellum. So this could be done by actually scraping off old texts that you had written on vellum and then writing a new text on top of it. So this is a kind of interesting way that a text can actually be written. And with modern technology, we can actually scan these documents and find out what the old text was, where the even after it has been scraped off. So this is kind of an interesting approach that vellum can be recycled. And this process of recycling is what's called the palimpsest. It's something where the vellum has been scraped off and then reused and recycled. Another solution is to just make your writing as small as possible and to make abbreviations of common words. So these abbreviations, fittingly, are called Scribal abbreviations. So abbreviations look pretty frequently like, so yeah, these are, the picture below shows some examples about how some Scribal abbreviations might have been made. And a lot of these symbols were developed because there are, at least in text written in Latin, there are a lot of letters that are written repeatedly. And so because of that, they were made into these kind of simplified symbols. And some of these Scribal abbreviations have actually survived today. So the and symbol that we're familiar with actually came as an abbreviation of the Latin word et. And similarly, the tilde used in Spanish was actually developed out of this kind of abbreviation in the way that older versions of Spanish had been written. Abbreviations like etc. to those kinds of, all these kinds of abbreviations resulted from the fact that vellum was such an expensive material to write on. So when we're talking about the development of the printing press, it's also important to keep in mind just how expensive vellum was, and these solutions here to make better use of vellum just underscores how how expensive vellum was and how economical people had to be with it. And finally, the last writing medium we should talk about is paper. Paper, as we kind of talked about, is a writing material made from plant matter. Usually this is a kind of wood fiber, which is produced by beating it into a pulp once it's mixed with water. And then that pulp is pressed into a thin sheet and then dried. And then that makes a very thin and lightweight material, but relatively durable and can be used as a thing that can be written on. So paper was a technique that had actually originated in China that we had kind of talked about fairly early on. And the technique of paper making, along with the woodblock printing, was considered one of the most important inventions of China. So then that invention traveled to the Middle East, where we see a picture in the top right here. And then it arrived in Europe in the 12th century in Italy. So paper not only involves one important component of the paper making process is the process of making that pulp, which you press into sheets. And in 1282, we see the first example of a paper mill, where water power is used to actually provide the force that produces the pulp that is used to make paper. So previously, paper had been something that is handmade, as you see in the picture in the top right. But with the development of the paper mill, it's much easier to make larger amounts of paper. And because of this, it significantly reduced the cost of paper. So once that had been developed, paper, we have this material that is fairly common in Europe. It's fairly easy to use because all you need for it is wood and a paper mill. And it becomes a material that is much cheaper than vellum. And this has a pretty important impact on the development of the printing press, which we'll be talking about in the next lesson.